The year was 1831, and across the American South, plantations stood as both monuments of wealth and prisons of cruelty. Beneath the polished floors of grand estates and the silken gowns of aristocratic women lay secrets darker than the shadows cast by their chandeliers. Families of great fortune often lived in fear of scandal, fear of exposure, and fear of their fragile dynasties crumbling under the weight of their own sins. Among them was one countess whose name, though once uttered with respect and envy, would be forever remembered for a pact so unthinkable it destroyed everything she sought to protect. The Countess was a woman of high breeding, her lineage tied to both European nobility and American fortune. Her world demanded perfection. A woman of her stature was not permitted weakness, scandal, or shame, yet shame was exactly what she believed awaited her when her fragile infant, born sickly, frail, and unlikely to survive, was placed in her arms. In a society where heirs were not simply children but living proof of legacy and power, her dynasty could not afford a blemish. An heir who appeared weak threatened not only the bloodline, but the entire foundation of her family's reputation. On the same night within the same estate, another child was born. This child belonged to an enslaved woman, a servant forced to give her body and her future to the demands of her master's house. The enslaved mother's baby was strong, healthy, and full of life. But unlike the Countess's child, he was born into chains, destined to live and die under the yoke of slavery. The contrast between the two infants, one frail yet privileged, the other strong yet enslaved, was too much for the Countess to ignore. It was then that a pact was struck, a pact whispered in candlelight and sealed with trembling hands. The Countess, desperate to save her family's name, demanded that the babies be exchanged. Her sickly infant would be raised as a slave, hidden from sight, while the enslaved woman's healthy child would be passed off as her own heir. For the enslaved mother, this was no choice, it was a command. To resist was to risk punishment, even death. With tears on her cheeks and rage buried deep in her chest, she gave her healthy child to a woman who owned her body, her labor, and now her blood. The deception worked, at least at first. The Countess's son grew into the role of heir, clothed in fine linens, taught to read and write, praised for his strength. Meanwhile, her true-born child, frail and weak, grew up in the slave quarters, his life marked by hunger, labor, and lashes. No one outside the pact could have guessed the truth, yet whispers began to ripple through the household. Some noticed the uncanny resemblance between the heir and the enslaved family. Others saw the way the Countess avoided gazing too long at the boy who looked nothing like his parents. What began as a desperate attempt to preserve a dynasty instead planted the seeds of its destruction. For years the lie held firm, but lies have a way of clawing their way to the surface. The exchanged children grew side by side, their lives divided by a fragile wall of privilege and oppression. They crossed paths, spoke words that carried strange familiarity, and shared glances that hinted at something deeper than coincidence. When the truth finally began to unravel, it did so with the fury of a storm. The pact that had been meant to preserve the Countess's legacy instead became the noose that strangled it. Betrayal spread like fire through the household, and with it came jealousy, rivalry, and bloodshed. For the enslaved mother, the pain of her stolen child never healed, and for the Countess, the legacy she tried so desperately to protect became her greatest curse. This is the story of the deadly Pact of 1831, tale of deception, power, and ruin. It is not merely about two babies exchanged in the shadows of a plantation house, but about the collision of bloodlines, the fragility of dynasties, and the haunting truth that no secret, no matter how deeply buried, stays hidden forever. In the end, the pact that was meant to shield a family from disgrace only destroyed it, leaving behind a legacy stained not with glory but with shame, whispers, and the echoes of two mothers who never stopped mourning the children they lost. The year was 1831, and North Carolina's humid summer wrapped its arms around the sprawling estate of Fairchild Manor. The plantation stood proud and imposing, its tall white columns gleaming in the sun, a symbol of wealth and power carved from soil soaked with sweat and blood. From the outside, it was a palace of order and prosperity. But like many houses built on bondage, its walls whispered secrets darker than the night, and its polished veneer masked cracks that were beginning to spread. Inside the mansion, Countess Eleanor Fairchild paced the length of her bedroom, her silk skirts swishing across the floorboards. Her pale face was flushed, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. She had just delivered a son, her long-awaited heir, but the moment she laid eyes on him, terror seized her heart. The infant was impossibly small, his skin pale and clammy, his tiny cries weak and unconvincing. He looked fragile, breakable, as though each breath might be his last. This was not the heir she had promised her husband. This was not the child who could carry the dynasty's name into the future. Her husband, Colonel Thomas Fairchild, was a man obsessed with legacy. He measured his worth not by kindness or honor, but by land wealth and the continuation of his bloodline. For years, Eleanor had endured his coldness, his cutting remarks, and his occasional cruelty, all under the expectation that she would give him a strong son. Now, as she cradled her frail child, she knew the truth: her husband would see him as a failure. And worse, he would see her as one too. In another wing of the plantation, beneath the same roof but in a world entirely different, another birth had just taken place. Clara, a young enslaved woman no older than 20, lay exhausted on a rough pallet in the servants' quarters. Her labor had been long and punishing, but her reward was a child whose first cry was strong, fierce, and alive. The baby boy squirmed with vigor, his dark eyes opening as though eager to see the world he had been born into. But Clara's joy was bitter. She knew the fate that awaited her son. He was not a child in the eyes of the Fairchild household. He was property. A life that would be catalogued in ledgers, traded, or whipped into obedience. Though her heart swelled with love, it broke with fear for the years to come. 2 mothers, 2 children, born under the same roof within hours of each other. One swaddled in silks, the other in coarse cloth. One destined for privilege, the other for chains. And yet, fate, cruel and twisted, had drawn them together in ways neither woman could have imagined. By the following morning, Eleanor's despair deepened. The household physician, after examining her infant, offered little comfort. "He is weak, my lady," he murmured, avoiding her eyes. "If he survives the month, it will be by God's mercy alone." Those words haunted her. Survive the month, God's mercy. She could already hear her husband's scorn. A frail son meant a frail legacy. It meant whispers among their peers, questions about whether the Fairchild line had been cursed. It meant humiliation, a wound Eleanor could not allow. That evening, as she sat in her chamber with the baby lying motionless in his crib, Eleanor's mind churned with desperation. Then, from the hallway outside, she overheard a conversation. 2 maids were gossiping about Clara, the young slave who had given birth to a strong and healthy boy. The words struck Eleanor like lightning: strong and healthy. In that instant, an idea, mad, unthinkable, but irresistible, took root in her mind. Clara was summoned to the mansion under the guise of providing milk for the Countess's newborn. Trembling, she entered the grand chamber, her own infant swaddled against her chest. She had never stood so close to the mistress of the house, and her knees nearly buckled under the weight of Eleanor's icy gaze. Eleanor studied Clara's child with an intensity that made the young woman clutch him tighter. His cheeks were full, his cries loud, his tiny fists clenched with life. He was everything Eleanor's son was not. "You have a fine child," Eleanor said softly, though her tone carried something sharp beneath it. "Strong, healthy, blessed." Clara lowered her head, unsure if she was being praised or mocked. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered, her voice quivering. The Countess stepped closer, her eyes darting between the 2 infants. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What if he could have a life beyond this? Clara froze. She didn't understand at first, but as the Countess's meaning became clear, her blood ran cold. Eleanor was suggesting the unthinkable, that they exchange the children. Clara's strong, healthy son would be raised as the Fairchild heir, while Eleanor's frail infant would be sent to the slave quarters hidden among the others. The proposal was madness. It was cruelty. It was theft of the most sacred kind. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. Her child was hers, and no mistress, no countess, no woman of silk and lace could take him. But Clara knew the truth. Refusal was not an option. She was property. Her body was owned, her labor commanded, and now, even her child's future dangled in the hands of the woman who ruled over her. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as Eleanor's words sealed her fate. "It is for the good of this household, for the dynasty. You will remain silent, and your child will live as a master, not as a slave." It was a bargain that was no bargain at all, and yet, with trembling hands, Clara surrendered her baby, pressing one last kiss to his forehead before the Countess swept him into her arms. In exchange, She was given the frail infant, who whimpered softly against her chest. He was weak, yes, but he was still a child, an innocent trapped in the schemes of the powerful. In that moment, the pact was made. It was silent, unrecorded, but its consequences would echo for generations. Two children's destinies had been rewritten in the flicker of candlelight. One would rise, cloaked in stolen privilege. The other would sink, bound by chains not of his making. That night, as Eleanor lay with the strong infant at her side, she finally exhaled with relief. To her, the danger had passed. Her dynasty was safe. The Fairchild name would endure. But in the servants' quarters, Clara held the frail child close, rocking him as tears streamed down her face. She whispered to him as though he could understand. "You were never meant for this life, little one, and my son was never meant for hers." The moonlight slipped through the cracks of the wooden shutters, casting thin lines across Clara's face. In that silver light, her grief turned to something colder. She had been robbed, her child stolen under the guise of survival. And though she dared not speak it aloud, a vow formed in her heart: one day the truth would surface. One day the pact would unravel. And when it did, it would destroy everything the Fairchilds had tried so desperately to preserve. The year that followed the deadly pact moved forward as though nothing had changed. The estate of Fairchild Manor remained a beacon of southern grandeur, whitewashed columns gleaming against the Carolina sun, fields of cotton swaying in the breeze, and the air filled with the rhythm of toil from enslaved bodies bending and breaking beneath the overseer's whip. Outwardly, the dynasty appeared unshaken. Inwardly, however, its very foundation had shifted forever. Inside the nursery of the manor's grandest wing, the infant now known as Edward Fairchild, the supposed heir of the dynasty, grew stronger each day. His cries filled the corridors, loud and demanding, a sound that brought relief to his mother Eleanor and pride to his father, Colonel Thomas Fairchild. No one questioned his vigor. The servants were instructed to spread word of his strength, and Eleanor herself displayed him proudly during visits from neighboring families. "A son born to lead," she would boast, while her eyes glittered with the satisfaction of a secret victory. But only Eleanor and Clara knew the truth, that Edward was not of her womb, but of Clara's. Each time Eleanor gazed upon him, a strange mixture of triumph and unease swirled inside her. He was strong, yes, but his features bore subtle shadows of the woman who had birthed him. His deep-set eyes, his sturdy frame, his broad nose, small whispers of another lineage that no silken clothes could entirely erase. Eleanor comforted herself with the thought that privilege could mask anything. Wealth, after all, was a stronger dye than blood. Far from the polished floors of the nursery, the child left in Clara's care was given another name: Samuel. Frail and pale, his body trembled often. His coughs rattling in the night, Clara held him tightly, caring for him as though he were her own, though her heart bled for the son she had lost. Each time she nursed Samuel, her eyes would drift to the mansion, imagining her healthy baby boy wrapped in silks, being cooed over by the very woman who had stolen him. Her fellow slaves whispered behind her back, sensing something strange about the boy. His skin was lighter than theirs, his features more delicate. Some said it was the mark of the master's blood, others claimed Clara had been cursed. Clara spoke nothing of the truth, for to reveal it was to sign her death warrant. Instead, she raised Samuel as best she could, rocking him through long nights, singing hymns that masked her grief. For all his weakness, Samuel possessed an intelligence that soon became clear. By the time he was walking, his eyes held a curious gleam. He noticed things others overlooked: the way overseers carried their whips, the subtle cracks in the barn walls, the way his mother, Clara, stiffened each time the Countess passed. It was as if, even as a child, Samuel sensed he was part of something hidden, something that did not quite belong. As the years passed, the contrast between Edward and Samuel grew sharper, like two branches stretching from the same tree in opposite directions. Edward was groomed for greatness. Tutors from Charleston arrived to teach him Latin, history, and arithmetic. He was dressed in fine suits imported from Europe, his days filled with lessons in manners, fencing, and horsemanship. He grew proud, demanding respect not only from the servants but from the slaves who bowed their heads as he passed. Colonel Fairchild doted on him, parading him before guests as proof of the family's enduring strength. And yet, Edward often carried with him a restlessness, a temper that burned hot. He did not know why he felt a constant need to prove himself, to crush others beneath his heel, but it lived inside him like a hunger. When boys from neighboring estates teased him for his broad shoulders and darker complexion, a storm of rage erupted in him. More than once, Eleanor had to intervene, assuring him he was the truest son of the Fairchild name. Samuel, meanwhile, toiled in the fields as soon as he was old enough to carry a bucket. His body remained weak, but his mind sharpened with each passing year. He asked questions others were afraid to voice. Questions about the world beyond the plantation gates, about freedom, about why some were masters and others slaves. Clara tried to hush him, afraid his curiosity would one day cost him his life. Yet she also nurtured his thirst for knowledge in secret. At night, she whispered letters to him, teaching him to trace them in the dirt with a stick. He picked up reading scraps from old ledgers discarded by the overseers, piecing together words in secret. Samuel's hunger for truth grew stronger with each passing season, even as his body remained fragile. The other slaves treated him with caution. Some pitied him for his weakness, others resented the extra attention Clara gave him. Whispers began to spread that Samuel did not belong, that he was somehow marked by the masters. Clara endured the whispers in silence, holding tight to the promise she had once made one day the truth would be known. By the time Edward and Samuel were 10 years old, the differences between them could no longer be ignored. Edward rode horses across the plantation fields, lording over the enslaved children as though he were already their master. Samuel, on the other hand, struggled to keep up with the grueling labor expected of him. Yet his sharp tongue often cut deeper than any whip. One day, fate placed them side by side. Edward had been ordered by his father to tour the fields, to learn the land he would inherit. Samuel, thin and coughing, was struggling to carry a basket of cotton. Their eyes met across the rows. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, recognition though neither boy could name it. Edward sneered. "Move faster, boy," he barked, parroting the overseer's tone. But his voice faltered slightly, and he could not explain the strange tug in his chest as he stared at Samuel's pale face. Samuel, in turn, felt a flicker of heat, anger, resentment, and something else, something that whispered he and this boy were connected in ways the world had not told them. As years turned into adolescence, the tension grew. Edward continued to live in the glow of privilege, yet whispers about his appearance followed him wherever he went. Neighbors questioned his features, servants exchanged knowing glances, and Eleanor's heart froze each time someone dared to comment. Samuel, meanwhile, grew sharper, bolder, his questions more dangerous. He longed for freedom, but more than that, he longed for justice, for answers about who he truly was. The Pact of 1831 had set both boys on paths that could not remain parallel forever. Fate would demand a reckoning, for 2 lives had been stolen and rewritten, and the truth lay buried like a ticking time bomb beneath Fairchild Manor. By the late 1840s, Fairchild Manor had changed little in appearance, but the air inside its walls had grown heavy with unspoken tensions. The boys of the Pact, now entering their teenage years, were no longer children who could be easily hidden behind lies. They were becoming men, sharper in feature, stronger in presence, and with every passing day, the truth of their origins threatened to rise like a ghost from the grave. Edward Fairchild, groomed as hair, now stood tall and broad-shouldered, his stride heavy with confidence. He rode the finest horses, attended lessons in Latin and law, and was often spoken of as the future of Fairchild blood. Yet, despite his privileges, Edward carried a burden that no one dared to name. The whispers followed him everywhere. His skin was darker than his mother's. His hair carried a curl that did not quite match the proud Anglo features of his supposed lineage. At gatherings with neighboring families, Eleanor smiled fiercely, defending him with honeyed words. But she could feel it, those sidelong glances, those muttered comparisons. When one visiting planter laughed and remarked, "Strong lad doesn't favor the conal much, though," Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. Edward, too, noticed. He would stare into the polished mirrors of the manor, studying his own face with suspicion. Why did he look so unlike his father? Why did his mother flinch when these questions arose? Each time, Eleanor brushed him off with reassurances, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Meanwhile, Samuel toiled in the fields, his body weary and frail, but his mind sharp as steel. He was 14 now, old enough to work full days, yet his lungs still rattled with coughs in the cold mornings. Other slaves often mocked him, calling him the weakling, who couldn't lift his share. But Samuel had something none of them did, a restless curiosity, a hunger for knowledge that no overseer's whip could beat out of him. At night, in secret, he read from scraps of discarded newspapers and books smuggled by Clara. His mind drank in the words like water to parched soil, and with each lesson, he began to question not just his own life but the entire order of the world around him. Why did Edward, who was no older than he, command respect and privilege, while he, Samuel, was treated as less than human? The truth had always hovered near, a shadow behind the curtains. When Samuel looked at Edward from across the fields, or during one of the colonel's inspections, he felt a strange echo, like seeing himself distorted in a mirror. Edward's stance, Edward's eyes, Edward's very presence felt familiar, too familiar. Clara, though silent, often looked at the two boys with a pain she could not hide. Samuel sensed her secret, even if she never dared to speak it aloud. The first spark of confrontation came one blistering summer afternoon. Edward had been ordered by his father to oversee a group of young slaves, Samuel among them, as they repaired a section of fencing along the cotton fields. With his riding crop in hand and his boots polished, Edward strutted along the row, barking commands with the arrogance of a boy drunk on borrowed power. Samuel, exhausted from the heat and his coughing, faltered with the heavy timber he carried. Edward, seizing the moment, strode over and struck him across the back with the crop. "Lift it, boy," Edward snarled, his voice echoing his father's cruelty. "Or I'll have you whipped until your bones snap." The others lowered their heads, afraid to intervene. But Samuel, instead of cowering, lifted his gaze. His eyes met Edward's, unflinching, burning with a quiet defiance. "You can strike me, but you can't make yourself a master," Samuel said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Blood don't lie." The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment Edward froze, his grip on the crop tightening. Something in Samuel's tone, something in his face, pierced him deeper than any insult could. He struck again, harder this time, as if to drown out the whisper of truth. Samuel fell to his knees, but his eyes never left Edward's. That night, Edward lay awake in his feathered bed, Samuel's words repeating over and over, "Blood don't lie." From then on, the rivalry between the two boys grew fiercer. Edward sought to assert dominance at every turn, punishing Samuel more harshly than the others, belittling him in front of the overseers. Yet beneath his cruelty lurked something unsettled. Edward could not explain why Samuel's face gnawed at him, why his mother's eyes seemed to dart away each time Samuel passed nearby. Samuel, on the other hand, began piecing together fragments of truth. He overheard whispers among the older slaves, how Clara's son had been taken from her, how the mistress's child had been weak and sickly. He watched Eleanor's uneasy stares, the way she tightened her grip on Edward's shoulder as though to shield him from suspicion. One evening, while helping Clara carry water, Samuel finally confronted her. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice low, urgent, "why do I look like them?" "And he looks like me." Clara froze, her hands trembling. For years she had carried the weight of silence, but Samuel's piercing eyes left her defenseless. Tears welled as she whispered, "Because the world you see ain't the world as it is. You were meant to live in that house, and he was meant to walk in your shoes. The truth, once spoken, could not be undone." Samuel staggered back, his mind reeling. The pieces clicked into place. The whispers, the resemblance, the cruelty of fate. He had been robbed of his birthright, while Edward lived in luxury on a throne built from stolen blood. The revelation ignited something dangerous inside Samuel. Anger, yes, but also purpose. He began to dream not only of freedom but of justice, of exposing the lie that held the dynasty together. He spoke less, observed more, waiting for the moment when truth could be wielded like a blade. Edward, too, grew restless. His temper worsened, his need for control sharpening into cruelty. Yet deep within him doubts gnawed like rats in the walls. Sometimes, when he caught his reflection in the mirror, he heard Samuel's words again, "Blood don't lie." By the time both boys reached 17, the air between them crackled with unspoken truth. They avoided each other when they could, but every glance carried weight. The pact made in 1831 had done more than exchange two babies. It had created two enemies bound by blood, secrets, and betrayal. The plantation thrived on its surface, the fields heavy with cotton, the colonel boasting of his heir's coming greatness. But beneath the grandeur, a storm brewed. Samuel now carried the truth in his heart, and Edward carried the doubt in his soul. Neither could escape what had been done. And as every secret does, this one clawed its way toward the light, promising destruction for all who tried to bury it. By 1848, Fairchild Manor glittered on the outside, but inside its walls groaned under the weight of secrets. Colonel Thomas Fairchild had grown older, his once commanding stride slowed by age and drink, but his obsession with legacy remained unbroken. Every decision, every investment, every command came with one refrain: Edward is the heir. The Fairchild line will endure. Edward, now a young man of 17, wore the title of heir like armor. To outsiders, he was everything the colonel wanted: a strong, educated son with the bearing of leadership. He rode tall, spoke with authority, and carried himself with the arrogance of privilege. But inside, Edward was crumbling. The whispers followed him everywhere. In Charleston, when he attended lessons, classmates muttered about his features. Strange complexion, they'd say, for a Fairchild. At plantation gatherings, elderly matrons would tilt their heads, studying him with narrowed eyes, then smile politely while whispering behind their fans. Edward hated it. He hated the way suspicion clung to him like smoke. Each night, he demanded answers from Eleanor. Why do they look at me that way? Why do I not resemble father? Eleanor would force a smile, caressing his cheek. Because you resemble me, my darling. You are every bit a Fairchild. Yet her eyes, tired and shadowed, betrayed the lie. Edward could feel it. Meanwhile, Samuel's world shifted dramatically after Clara's confession. For years he had wondered, but now he knew. The blood in his veins was Fairchild blood. The silks, the books, the privileges Edward enjoyed, they were rightfully his. Yet here he was, a slave bent under the overseer's lash while his stolen brother lived as master. The knowledge filled Samuel with a cold, relentless fury. He no longer shrank from the overseer's punishments, no longer lowered his eyes when Edward passed. Instead, he carried himself with a quiet defiance, as though daring the world to challenge him. Among the other slaves, his presence grew magnetic. He spoke softly of injustice, of secrets buried in the house, of bloodlines twisted by lies. Some dismissed him as bitter, but others listened, nodding in the shadows. Samuel was no longer just a weak, coughing boy. He was becoming a leader. The inevitable clash came during a harvest season. Edward had been ordered by his father to supervise the picking of cotton. Samuel was among the field hands, his thin body straining under the sun, his cough echoing in the rows. Edward, crop in hand, strutted like a miniature colonel. "You there?" Edward barked, pointing to Samuel. "You're lagging. Do you think yourself above the others?" Samuel straightened, sweat dripping down his brow. His voice, though hoarse, carried across the field. "Above them? No. But I know I'm not beneath you." The overseers froze. The slaves stopped their work, the air thick with shock. No one spoke to the master's hair that way. Edward's face burned crimson. He stormed forward, crop raised. "You dare?" Samuel caught the crop mid-swing, his frail arm trembling but unbroken. Their eyes locked, and for a moment time itself seemed to pause. Samuel leaned in, his voice low, cutting. "You live in my house, you eat my bread, you ride my horse! But you wear a name that isn't yours. You know it, don't you? You've always known." Edward's grip faltered. The overseers rushed in, tearing Samuel away, striking him down into the dirt. Blood pooled from his mouth, but Samuel's eyes never wavered. He stared up at Edward, daring him to deny the truth. That night, Edward could not sleep. Samuel's words echoed like a curse: "You live in my house. You wear a name that isn't yours." The seed of doubt that had haunted him for years now grew into a forest of suspicion. Eleanor sensed the shift immediately. Edward grew moody, restless, prone to sudden rages. He questioned her with sharper words, his eyes narrowing as though he could pierce her soul. One evening, in the privacy of her chambers, he confronted her outright. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice shaking. "Whose son am I?" Eleanor's heart stopped. She tried to soothe him, but Edward grabbed her wrist, his grip trembling with desperation. "Do not lie to me again, mother. I see it. I hear it. I feel it. That boy. Samuel, he looks at me like we are bound." "Tell me, is he?" Her silence was answer enough. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I did what I had to do. For you, for this family, for the dynasty." The Edward staggered back, his chest heaving. "So it's true. I am not." His voice broke. "I am not father's son. You are my son," Eleanor cried, reaching for him. "You are everything I ever wanted to protect." But Edward recoiled. The walls of his world cracked, his identity unraveling with every heartbeat. Down in the quarters, Samuel healed from his beating. Each scar a reminder of the confrontation. He no longer doubted himself, he knew who he was. And though Clara begged him to remain silent, Samuel began to speak more boldly among the slaves. "They think their blood makes them masters," he said one night, his voice carrying in the flicker of firelight. "But their blood runs in me, and if their blood makes them rulers, then it makes me the same. One day their lies will fall, and when they do, we will rise." For the first time, hope flickered in the eyes of those who listened. Samuel's words were dangerous, but they were powerful. The Fairchild dynasty now balanced on a knife's edge. Edward, torn between the world that had raised him and the truth of his stolen blood, grew reckless. Samuel, emboldened by knowledge, began planting seeds of rebellion. And Eleanor, haunted by the pact she had forged years ago, watched helplessly as her secret unraveled. The deadly pact of 1831 had done more than switch two infants. It had birthed a storm, and its first lightning now crackled across the skies of Fairchild Manor. Colonel Thomas Fairchild sat on the wide veranda of his manor, pipe smoke curling around his weathered face. At 60, he was still broad-shouldered, his voice still sharp enough to command men, but there was something in his eyes that had changed. Age brought him no peace. Instead, it brought unease. The colonel had always prided himself on control of his land, of his wealth, of his bloodline. Yet for months now, rumors swirled like vultures. Whispers of strange resemblances, questions that would not die. And though he barked at his men to silence such talk, the words lodged themselves in his mind. Edward, his heir, stood in the fields with the overseers that afternoon, tall, proud, but strangely restless. Samuel, the sickly slave boy who should have been nothing more than a shadow, had grown into something else entirely, sharp-eyed, bold, and defiant. Even from afar, the colonel could sense a strange current between them, like two magnets drawn and repelled at once. That evening, when Edward joined his father for supper, Thomas studied him more closely than ever before. The boy was handsome, but there was something foreign in his features, something he could not place in the Fairchild line. His jaw tightened. "Boy," the colonel said suddenly, his voice deep, "you've been unsettled. What troubles you?" Edward shifted in his chair. For weeks, he had wrestled with the truth Eleanor had whispered in her broken confession. He wanted to demand answers from his father, to scream, "Am I truly your son?" But fear clamped his throat. "Nothing, sir," Edward said, his voice steady but cold. The colonel's eyes narrowed. He had spent his life reading men, slaves, soldiers, rivals in business. He could smell lies the way a hound smelled blood. And now, for the first time, he smelled it in his son. Meanwhile, Samuel's influence in the quarters grew stronger. His defiance in the cotton fields had not gone unnoticed. Where once he had been seen as fragile, now he was whispered of as brave. Men and women huddled around him at night, listening as he spoke of freedom and justice. "They are not gods," Samuel told them, his voice rising. "They bleed as we bleed. Their riches are built on our bones, but their walls are cracking. You feel it, don't you? Their lies cannot hold forever." The others nodded, their eyes alight with something dangerous, hope. But Samuel's boldness also caught the eye of the overseers. One reported his speeches to the colonel, who listened in silence, his jaw tightening. "The boy is stirring unrest," the overseer warned. "He carries himself too proudly. He is not like the others." The colonel dismissed him with a wave, but later alone, he sat in his study, glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the portraits of his ancestors. The words gnawed at him. Samuel, not like the others. And the resemblance he had long ignored now pressed itself into his thoughts. Samuel's sharp cheekbones, the line of his brow, even the fire in his eyes. They were Fairchild eyes. The colonel clenched his fist around the glass until it cracked in his hand. He would not allow doubt to infect his legacy. Days later, Edward rode into Charleston on errands. Yet the city, once his playground, had become a torment. Everywhere, he felt eyes on him. At the academy, boys his age whispered. At the marketplace, an old merchant woman gave him a long, searching look and muttered, "Strange blood, that one." By the time he returned to Fairchild Manor, his rage boiled over. He stormed into his mother's chambers, slamming the door. Eleanor, startled, dropped her embroidery. "Mother," Edward hissed, his voice shaking with fury. "They all see it. They all whispered, I am no Fairchild. And that boy, Samuel, he mocks me, he dares to challenge me as if he knows." Eleanor's face drained of color. "Edward, please." But Edward cut her off, his voice rising to a scream. "Tell me everything, or I swear I'll drag the truth from Samuel's mouth myself." His rage terrified her. For years, she had carried the weight of her sin, convincing herself it was for the family's survival. But now she saw it unraveling, her son collapsing under the burden of her secret. She fell to her knees, clutching his hands. "I did it to protect you," she cried. "I did it to save you from a life of chains. You are my son, Edward, even if you are not." She choked on the words. "Not his." Edward ripped his hands away, trembling as though struck. His world had ended. That night Samuel stood in the fields, looking up at the stars. Clara found him there, clutching a shawl against the chill. "You must be careful," she whispered. "They're watching you. If the colonel even suspects—" Samuel turned, his expression hard. "Let him suspect. The truth is stronger than his lies." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Truth won't save you. Truth will kill you." Samuel looked back at the sky, his face illuminated by moonlight. "Then let it. Better to die as who I am than live as what they made me." The storm broke days later. The colonel summoned both Edward and Samuel to the manor, an unprecedented act. The slaves whispered as Samuel was led into the grand hall, his chains clinking against the polished floor. Edward stood stiffly by his father's chair, his face pale but defiant. Eleanor hovered in the doorway, trembling. The colonel's voice thundered in the silence. "There is talk in these lands. Talk that dishonors my name. I will have the truth." His eyes, hard as iron, bore into Edward. "Tell me, boy, are you my son?" Edward's lips parted. But no sound came. His gaze flicked to Samuel, then to his mother, then back to the colonel. Samuel, chained though he was, stepped forward. His voice, steady and fearless, cut through the hall. "Ask her, colonel. She knows the truth. She buried it with the bodies of your slaves. She buried it in me. She buried it in him." The hall fell into a stunned silence. Eleanor gasped, her hand to her mouth. The colonel's face turned white, then crimson. His world, his dynasty, everything he had built, was slipping away. "Silence!" he roared, slamming his cane on the floor. But in that echoing boom, the walls of Fairchild Manor seemed to tremble, as though even the house itself knew that the secret could no longer be contained. The deadly Pact of 1831 was no longer a whisper. It was now a weapon, sharp and merciless, poised to destroy them all. The cane cracked against the marble floor again, echoing like a gunshot. Colonel Fairchild's face was a storm, purple with fury, his chest heaving as if each breath carried the weight of his dynasty's collapse. "You dare speak to me of blood, boy?" he roared at Samuel. "You, a slave, dare claim ties to my house?" Samuel did not flinch. His wrists ached in chains, yet his back remained straight. "You can chain me," he said quietly, "but you cannot chain the truth." The words hit harder than any whip. For the first time in his life, the colonel felt cornered, not by armies, not by rivals, but by a boy who should have been beneath him. The silence in the hall stretched, broken only by Eleanor's ragged breathing. She stood frozen, her lips trembling, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please, let this end. I did what I had to." Her husband's head snapped toward her. "You dare speak now? You, who brought this poison into my house!" His hand shook as he pointed at her, the veins in his neck throbbing. "This is your doing. Your weakness. Your treachery." Eleanor dropped her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. For years she had endured his temper, but this fury was different, wild, unmoored, born from fear. She could feel the walls closing in, the pact unraveling, the ghost of her choice standing in the room in the flesh. Edward stood stiff as a statue, caught between his father's rage and his mother's shame, his heart hammered, his throat dry. He looked at Samuel, so steady, so sure, and a spark of jealousy ignited inside him. "Why does he stand proud while I, the heir, am collapsing?" The colonel slammed his cane down again, the crack reverberating through the hall. "Take him to the whipping post," he ordered. His voice was cold, dangerous. "I'll scour the insolence out of him. He will learn what it means to defy me." The overseers stepped forward, but before they could touch him, Samuel raised his voice. "Whip me, kill me. It will not change what your wife confessed. You can bury me in the fields, colonel, but your name will rot all the same." A gasps filled the hall. Even the overseers hesitated, glancing nervously at their master. Never before had a slave spoken such words in this house. The colonel's hand trembled on his cane. His mind screamed to silence the boy, to crush him before the whispers spread further. But deep inside, a fear gnawed at him, the fear that Samuel was right. That night, Eleanor sat in her chambers, hands clasped in prayer. She had not prayed in years, yet now she whispered desperate pleas to a God she no longer trusted. Her son hated her husband raged at her, and the boy she had condemned to chains stood taller than them all. "Lord," she whispered, tears staining her cheeks, "forgive me. Forgive the lie I birthed. Forgive the child I damned." Her maid, Clara, hovered in the corner, pale and shaken. She had overheard the confrontation. "Mistress," Clara whispered, "the quarters are restless. They say Samuel is chosen. They say he will bring change." Eleanor's heart sank. Change was not what the colonel would tolerate. Change meant blood. In the slave quarters, Samuel's defiance had already become legend. Word of his words to the colonel spread like fire. Men and women gathered close, their whispers urgent, their eyes alight. "He faced the master and did not bow," one said. "He spoke truth in his house," another murmured. "He is the one we've waited for," a third whispered. But Samuel shook his head when they pressed him. "I am no savior," he told them. "I am only a man who has seen too much." Yet in his heart, he felt the pull of destiny. His life had always been a chain, yet now he held the chance to break it. Not just for himself, but for all of them. At the manor, Edward could not sleep. He paced his room, fury and doubt tearing him apart. His father had dismissed him that evening with harsh words, calling him weak, unfit to be heir. His mother had begged him to forgive her, but he could not bear to look at her. And Samuel haunted him most of all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his rival's steady gaze, unafraid even in chains. How can he, a slave, carry himself like a lord, while I, the heir? Shame in that moment, Edward's jealousy twisted into something darker. If Samuel lives, I will always be a shadow. If Samuel dies, perhaps I can still be saved. The next morning, the colonel called for Eleanor. His face was pale, sleepless, his temper simmering. "The boy will be whipped," he declared, publicly. "Before the slaves, before the overseers. Let them see what happens to defiance." Eleanor fell to her knees. "Thomas, please, have mercy. If you harm him, you will only prove the whispers true. They will not fear you. They will hate you." The colonel's jaw clenched. Better to be hated than undone. But as he spoke, he realized he no longer believed his own words. Hatred breeds rebellion, and rebellion meant the collapse of everything he had built. Still, his pride would not let him yield. "It is decided," he snapped. When Samuel was dragged to the yard at noon, the sky itself seemed heavy, clouds rolling thick and gray. The slaves gathered in silence, their faces grim. Edward stood at his father's side, his expression unreadable, though inside his heart hammered with dread and envy. Eleanor, pale as death, clutched her shawl, her lips moving in frantic prayer. Samuel was tied to the post, his shirt ripped from his back. The whip cracked through the air, but Samuel did not cry out. Blow after blow landed, flesh tearing, blood staining the ground, yet his eyes never left the colonel's. "Is this your legacy?" Samuel gasped between strikes. "To kill your own blood, to whip your own son." The yard erupted in whispers, the words spreading like wildfire. The overseers faltered. The colonel's face went white as ash. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice shaking. "Enough!" The whip fell silent. Samuel hung limp but unbroken, his words echoing louder than the cracks of leather. For the first time in decades, the colonel felt the eyes of his slaves not in fear, but in judgment. And he knew, deep inside, that the walls of his empire were beginning to crumble. The whip marks on Samuel's back had barely healed when the plantation seemed to shift. Silence hung in the air, heavy and charged, as though every breath taken was in anticipation of the next storm. The slaves worked in the fields with bowed heads, but their eyes, those eyes, burned with a quiet fire. Overseers barked louder, swung harder, but fear no longer had the same bite. And at the center of it all stood Edward Fairchild. He had watched Samuel tied to the post, watched him endure blow after blow without breaking. And instead of satisfaction, instead of relief that his rival had been humbled, Edward had felt something far worse, a shame. Samuel had stood proud, even in chains. Samuel had spoken words that echoed louder than the whip. And in the whispers of the slaves, in the glances that passed between them, Edward saw it. Admiration. Admiration for a slave. Contempt for their so-called heir. That night in his chamber, Edward raged. He threw a porcelain vase against the wall. shattering it into pieces. He paced the floor like a caged animal, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles bled. "He will not take what is mine," he muttered to himself, voice shaking. "He will not take my birthright. My blood, my name, my future, it is mine." But deep down, Edward knew. Samuel was no ordinary slave. He was his mirror, his rival, perhaps even his better. And if the truth was ever spoken beyond the walls of Fairchild Manor, Edward would be reduced to nothing but a shadow. Meanwhile, Colonel Fairchild sat in his study, whiskey glass trembling in his hand. The echoes of Samuel's words at the whipping post still rang in his ears. Your own blood, your own son. The colonel had spent his life building walls of order, discipline, and control. But now cracks ran through them all. Doubt poisoned his veins. Samuel's features, the sharp line of his cheekbones, the fire in his eyes. It was like staring into a distorted reflection of himself. And Edward, his supposed heir, weak, trembling, consumed with jealousy. Was this truly the son he had built his empire for? For the first time, the colonel admitted to himself that the lie might be real. And it terrified him. In her chambers, Eleanor wept quietly. Her prayers no longer brought comfort. Her guilt pressed down heavier each day. She had thought she could bury her sin, that the switch she made in the shadows would be forgotten. But the truth had grown like a weed, breaking through every wall she tried to build around it. She saw it in Edward's eyes. Resentment, confusion, despair. She saw it in Samuel's defiance, pride, strength, unbroken spirit. And in the colonel's rage, she saw the downfall of everything. Clara, her maid, whispered warnings of unrest in the quarters. "They speak his name, mistress," Clara told her. "Samuel. They say he is chosen. They say he will lead them." Eleanor's hands shook as she gripped Clara's wrist. "Then he will die," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Because Thomas will never allow it." Edward had already made up his mind. The whip had failed to break Samuel. His father's fury had failed to silence him. And Eleanor's whispers only made the truth louder. If Samuel lived, Edward would never be free of him. So Edward sought out the overseer, a cruel man named Briggs, known for his brutality. One evening, in the shadows of the stables, Edward pressed a pouch of gold coins into Briggs's palm. "The slave," Edward said, his voice low but urgent. "Samuel, I want him gone. Quietly, no whips, no spectacle. Take him into the woods and make sure he does not return." Briggs smirked, his teeth yellow in the dim light. "A dangerous task, young master. He's not like the others. But for this coin, consider it done." Edward's heart pounded, but he forced himself to nod. "No one must know. If my father suspects," Briggs cut him off with a laugh. "Your father won't hear a whisper. By dawn, the boy will be nothing but carrion for the crows." Edward walked away trembling, telling himself it was necessary, telling himself it was justice. But deep in his soul, he knew it was fear. Samuel, however, was not blind. He had seen Edward's hatred burning brighter each day, and he had heard whispers of overseers lurking near his quarters. One night, as he sat by the fire in the slave camp, Clara approached him. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "They mean to kill you," she whispered urgently. "Edward, he's paid Briggs. Tonight, they'll take you into the woods." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he did not look surprised. "So the hare chooses cowardice," he murmured. "You must run," Clara begged. "Run before they come." Samuel shook his head. His eyes burned with something fiercer than fear. "If I run, I prove them right that I am nothing but a slave, nothing but a shadow to be hunted. No, I will not run. I will face them. And when I do, they will see who I truly am." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Then you'll die." "Maybe," Samuel said quietly, staring into the flames. "But not as their prisoner, not as their lie. I will die as Samuel Fairchild, son of two worlds and destroyer of the one that bound me." As midnight fell, Briggs and two men crept into the quarters, lanterns dimmed, blades in their hands. They found Samuel waiting, unchained, his eyes cold as steel. "You came for me," he said, his voice calm. "Then come." The men hesitated, startled by his defiance. Briggs snarled and lunged, but Samuel moved like a man with nothing left to lose. The fight was quick, brutal. Chains turned into weapons, fire into fury. By the time it ended, two overseers lay broken in the dirt, and Briggs fled into the trees, blood streaming from his face. The slaves who had watched in silence erupted, their whispers turning to cries. "Samuel! Samuel!" they shouted. In that moment, Samuel knew there was no going back. Edward's hatred had lit the spark. Now the fire had begun to spread. Back at the manor, Edward lay awake, waiting for news. When Briggs stumbled in at dawn, bleeding and broken, Edward's heart sank. He's still alive. Briggs spat, clutching his side. Alive, and they're chanting his name. You've made him a martyr, boy. You've made him a leader. Edward's blood ran cold. He had tried to kill his rival, but instead he had created something far worse, a rebellion waiting to ignite. And from the shadows of her chamber, Eleanor prayed again, not for forgiveness, but for survival, because she knew the dynasty was collapsing and the first stone had already fallen. The plantation had changed. What once was silence, broken only by the crack of whips and the drone of overseers, now pulsed with whispers, low, urgent, and dangerous. Samuel's defiance had planted a seed, and Briggs's humiliating defeat had watered it with blood. By dawn, the Fairchild estate no longer belonged to its masters. It belonged to the Whispers. In the cotton fields, slaves bent low, hands moving automatically, but their voices buzzed like a swarm of bees. Samuel stood tall, they said. Hay fought them. He did not bow. For years they had borne their chains in silence, but now the silence was cracking. And the colonel heard it. From his study window, Thomas Fairchild watched the fields with narrowed eyes. He had ruled these lands for decades, his word law, his whip gospel. But now, the air felt different. The rhythm of obedience had broken. His empire was no longer solid, it was trembling. When Briggs staggered into the manor, bruised, bloody, humiliated, Thomas's worst fears crystallized. You let him live, the colonel thundered, slamming his fist onto the desk. One man! A slave! And you return to me beaten. Briggs spat blood into the fireplace. He's no ordinary man, colonel. He fights like he's got the devil himself in him. And worse, he's got them all chanting his name. You've not got a slave anymore. You've got a prophet in chains. The colonel's jaw tightened, his face pale beneath his fury. Then we will remind them who rules here, call the overseers, arm them, double the patrols. But deep inside, Thomas knew the truth. Force could break bodies, yes, but not fire, and Samuel was fire. Edward stood in the doorway, pale, trembling, his eyes flicking nervously between Briggs and his father. Every word was a dagger in his chest. He had wanted Samuel gone. He had wanted silence. But instead, his plan had backfired spectacularly. Now Samuel was not just alive, he was becoming a symbol. Edward's shame burned him raw. They whisper his name, not mine. They follow his fire, not my blood. Later in his chamber, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face looked weak, pale, twisted by fear. And in his mind, he saw Samuel's eyes, calm, defiant, unbroken. No, Edward whispered, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. This is still my inheritance. This land, this house, it is mine, and I will not lose it to him. But the more he repeated the words, the hollower they sounded. Down in the quarters, Samuel sat by the fire, surrounded by quiet figures who edged closer as the night deepened. Old women with weathered faces, strong men with calloused hands, and children who should have been sleeping. All leaned in, their eyes wide, their breaths held. You stood against them. One man whispered, and you lived. Samuel shook his head. I did not fight for myself. I fought because they would kill me for daring to breathe free. And if they would kill me, they would kill you too. That is the truth. Another voice, this time a woman's, sharp and firm. Then what do we do? Do we wait? Do we bow again until the whip breaks us all? The fire crackled. Samuel looked at them, each face etched with pain, fear, and a flicker of hope. For years he had resisted in silence. But now silence was no longer enough. We prepare, he said finally. We do not rise in anger. We rise in unity. And when we rise to win. The crowd murmured, their whispers like embers feeding a flame. For the first time, they saw not just a man among them, but a leader. In the manor, Eleanor felt the walls closing in. She heard the whispers too, carried even into her chamber by Clara's trembling lips. She knew rebellion when she saw it. It was not sudden fire, but slow smoke that spread until the whole house burned. She knelt at her bedside, clutching the rosary so tightly it dug into her palms. God, forgive me, she whispered. Forgive me for the switch, for the lie, for the seed I planted that now grows into ruin. But even as she prayed, she could not help but think of Samuel, not as a slave, not even as a danger, but as her son. The truth twisted her heart like a blade. The colonel called a meeting in the great hall, summoning Edward, Briggs, and every overseer on the estate. Candles flickered against the walls. shadows dancing like demons across the faces of men who smelled of sweat, iron, and blood. "We are at war," the colonel declared, his voice booming. "Not with muskets, not with bayonets, but with shadows in our own house. A war of whispers. A war of loyalty. And if we do not end it now, then Fairchild Plantation will drown in its own blood." A Briggs leaned on the table, sneering. "Then let us burn their quarters. Drive them into fear before they rise too high." A murmur of agreement spread, but Edward shifted uneasily. His stomach churned. Fire would silence them, yes, but it would also destroy what was left of their fortune, and worse, it would prove Samuel right. The colonel slammed his hand down. "No fires. Not yet. We will break them with discipline. Starve them. Chain them tighter. Remind them who holds the whip." But even as he spoke, he knew discipline was a crumbling wall. Fear was no longer enough. That night the overseers patrolled with lanterns and rifles. The quarters were locked, chains rattling on doors, dogs barking in the fields. But inside the dark cabins, hope burned brighter than fear. Samuel whispered plans, strategies, promises. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the dynasty. By dawn, the plantation seemed outwardly unchanged. The same rows of cotton, the same bowed backs, the same barked commands. But beneath the surface, something unstoppable had begun, and in the great house, Colonel Fairchild poured whiskey into his glass with shaking hands, whispering to himself like a man trying to outrun fate. "This land is mine. This name is mine. This dynasty is mine." But even he could hear it now. The whispers, the chants, the fire. And they were no longer his to silence. The summer heat of 1831 clung to the Fairchild Plantation like a curse. The air was thick, unmoving, as if the earth itself held its breath. The quarters lay locked as always, overseers circling like wolves, rifles slung, lanterns swinging in the dark. The colonel believed his grip was firm, but what he could not see was that the iron had already begun to rust. Inside one of the small wooden cabins, Samuel's voice carried like a storm, brewing in whispers. The room was full, men, women, even children pressed close, their eyes glowing in the candlelight. Every face carried scars, some on skin, others carved deep into the soul. "They think we are weak," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. "They think we are broken, but they forget we are many, and they are few." A murmur of agreement swelled. For weeks he had prepared them, teaching strength, planning routes, gathering what little weapons they could find. Stolen knives, farming tools, even sharpened wood hardened in fire. It wasn't much, but Samuel's fire gave them something far greater than steel. It gave them purpose. A boy no more than 12 lifted his chin. "When do we rise, Samuel?" The room fell silent. Samuel looked at the boy, and then at the faces around him. He could feel the weight of their hope. "Tonight," he said. "We rise tonight." Up in the great house, the colonel sat with a glass of whiskey, staring into the fire. He told himself his dynasty was eternal, his name untouchable. Yet his hand trembled around the glass. Briggs's defeat, Edward's weakness, Eleanor's silence. It all gnawed at him. "They whisper," he muttered aloud. "But whispers are nothing, nothing." But even as he said it, the sound of dogs barking outside made him jolt. Something was stirring. Edward sat in his chamber, drenched in sweat. He kept hearing Samuel's name in his head like a curse. Samuel had become the man he could never be. Edward wanted to scream, to claw the name from existence. But deep down, he knew the truth. Samuel's fire was stronger than his blood. Midnight fell. The first strike came in silence. One overseer, patrolling near the quarters, vanished into the dark, pulled into the shadows by 3 strong hands, his rifle seized, his throat cut. Another followed, dragged behind the stables. Within minutes, lantern lights flickered out across the plantation, one by one, until the night was swallowed whole. Then came the roar. The slaves burst from their cabins like a flood breaking a dam. Their voices rose into a single, thunderous cry, rage, grief, and freedom tangled into one. The overseers scrambled, rifles cracking, but panic spread faster than powder. Samuel was at the front, wielding nothing but a stolen blade, his eyes burning like fire. "For every lash!" he cried. "For every child torn from its mother! For every drop of blood! Tonight we rise!" They surged forward. Chains became weapons, farm tools became spears, and fists struck with the power of generations. The overseers, once gods of the fields, found themselves drowning beneath the tide. The colonel awoke to chaos. The sound of gunfire, the clash of steel, the screams of men outside. He burst into the hall, rifle in hand, barking orders. "Stand your ground! Hold them back!" But when he looked through the window, his blood ran cold. The fields were on fire. The cotton blazed, flames clawing at the sky. The quarters swarmed with figures rising from years of silence into a storm of vengeance. It was not a riot. It was war. Eleanor, pale and trembling, stood at the top of the staircase. "Thomas," she whispered, "it's begun." The colonel turned to her, eyes blazing with fury. This is your doing. You brought him here. You sowed this treachery." She said nothing. For once, she did not deny it. Edward stumbled into the hall, his face white as bone. "Father, we cannot hold them. They're too many." The colonel slapped him hard across the face. "Coward! This house will not fall!" He shoved a rifle into his son's shaking hands. Fight or die with nothing. But Edward's heart was already breaking. He saw Samuel in the fire, saw him standing tall where Edward only cowered. For the first time, Edward realized the dynasty was already lost. Outside, Samuel pressed forward through the smoke, his blade flashing. Every step he took, others followed. One overseer fell with his chest split open. Another screamed as fire swallowed him whole. For years, the slaves had bent under whips. Now it was the overseer's turn to taste fear. At the front of the charge, Samuel spotted the manor, its windows glowing, its tall columns rising like a fortress. He knew what lay inside, the men who had built their empire on broken backs. The dynasty itself. He raised his arm. To the house. The cry rose again, and they stormed forward, a tide of vengeance against stone and wood. Inside, the colonel braced at the door with Briggs and the remaining overseers. "Hold the line!" he roared. "This is our house!" "Our blood," but his words drowned beneath the roar outside. The first blow struck the door, then another and another. The wood groaned, splinters flying. Edward stood frozen, rifle shaking in his hands. Eleanor stood silent at the stairs, rosary slipping from her fingers. Then the door burst open, smoke, fire, and Samuel stepped into the hall. His chest heaved, his eyes locked on the colonel. Time itself seemed to stop. "This ends tonight," Samuel said. "Then come, boy. Come and take it." The hall erupted in chaos. Steel clashed, shots rang, men screamed. The overseers fell one by one. Briggs fought like a rabid beast, but Samuel's blade found him, driving deep into his chest. Briggs's roar choked into silence as he crumpled to the floor. The colonel fought fiercely, striking down two men, but age and fury could not match fire and unity. Samuel pressed him back, step by step, until the proud master was cornered against the very walls of his dynasty. Edward dropped his rifle. He could not fight. He could not even move. He watched his father falter, watched Samuel stand tall, and something inside him broke. At last the colonel fell, his rifle torn from his hands, his body forced to the floor. Samuel stood over him, blade in hand, the firelight casting his shadow like a giant across the walls. "You built this house on our bones," Samuel said. "Now you will be buried in it." The colonel's eyes blazed with defiance even as the blade pressed to his throat. "I am Fairchild. I am the South. You cannot kill me." Samuel's voice was steady. "Then history will." And with a final strike, the dynasty's master fell. The manor shook as flames spread, walls groaning as smoke filled the air. Eleanor sank to her knees, whispering prayers, tears streaking her face. Edward collapsed, trembling, muttering, "It's gone. It's all gone." Samuel stood tall among the fire. His people gathered around him. For the first time, they were not slaves. They were free. But freedom had come at a cost. The fields burned, the house crumbled, the blood of masters and overseers soaking into the soil. The Fairchild dynasty was finished, and from its ashes, a new chapter of history began. The Fairchild plantation smoldered like a corpse left on the battlefield. Columns that once gleamed white now stood blackened, cracked, and broken. The manor's grand staircase lay buried in ash. The fields, once stretching endlessly with cotton, were nothing but charred earth, smoke rising like a mourning veil. But amidst the ruin, life stirred. Men, women, and children stepped cautiously from the shadows, their chains broken, their backs unbowed. They had slept that night not in cabins of oppression, but under the open sky, watching as the fire consumed the house of their masters. For the first time in their lives, they awoke without the crack of a whip. For the first time, they awoke free. Samuel stood at the edge of the burned fields, the dawn painting the horizon with streaks of gold and blood red. His body bore wounds from the night of battle, but his spirit burned fiercer than ever. Around him the people gathered, waiting not as slaves for commands, but as equals seeking guidance. He looked at them, the old, who had survived decades of torment, the young, who had known nothing but chains, the mothers clutching their children close. He saw in their eyes the same question, what now? For a long time, Samuel said nothing. He let the silence settle, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. Then he spoke. This land has fed on our blood for too long. It gave us nothing but pain. We will not stay here to rebuild their house. We will build our own. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising. Some nodded eagerly. Others looked uncertain, fear still lingering in their bones. One elder, her hair white as ash, stepped forward. Where will we go, Samuel? The roads are dangerous. The law hunts us. If we are caught— Samuel met her gaze steadily. If we are caught, then we will fight again. Better to die free than live a lifetime in chains. His words hung heavy in the air, but slowly voices rose in agreement. The people were ready, not for safety, but for freedom. Inside the ruins of the manor, Eleanor knelt among the ashes of her chamber. Her rosary, blackened by fire, slipped through her fingers. She had prayed for mercy, prayed for forgiveness, but none came. She whispered into the silence, "This is my punishment." For years, she had hidden the truth, that Samuel carried her blood, that the lie of inheritance had poisoned them all. Now, as she watched the smoke rise from her destroyed home, she felt the weight of that secret crushing her. Clara, her maid, approached quietly, her dress torn, her eyes swollen from tears. "Mistress, you must leave." "It's over." Eleanor looked up, her face pale but resolute. "I will not run, Clara. This house was built on sin. Perhaps it is fitting I be buried with it." Clara shook her head. "The house has fallen, but you are not yet buried. Come." For the first time, Eleanor let herself be led, not as mistress, but as woman broken, stripped of pride, walking into a world where the name Fairchild meant nothing. Edward wandered the ruins like a ghost. His clothes hung in tatters, his face hollow, his eyes empty. He muttered to himself, repeating the words he had once believed. "This land is mine. This dynasty is mine." But the words rang hollow now. The plantation was gone, his father was dead, and the dynasty lay in ashes. He had inherited nothing but dust. When Samuel crossed his path, Edward froze. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the hair of blood and the hair of fire. Edward's lips trembled, but no words came. Samuel regarded him with neither hatred nor pity, only finality. "Your father is gone. His house is gone. Leave, Edward. Leave and never return." Edward dropped his gaze, shoulders collapsing. Without a word, he stumbled away, vanishing into the forest like a man already dead. By midday, the freed people had gathered what little they could salvage: food, water, blankets, and tools. They stood at the edge of the land, the plantation smoldering behind them. Samuel raised his voice. "This place was our prison. Today it becomes our grave for the past. Let us bury it and walk into tomorrow." The crowd erupted in cheers, hoarse, ragged, but filled with life. Together, they turned their backs on the Fairchild estate and stepped onto the road. Each step was heavy with uncertainty, but each was also a declaration. They were no longer property. They were no longer shadows. They were people moving toward a horizon unclaimed by chains. Weeks passed. Rumors spread across counties, whispered in taverns, shouted in pulpits, carried by fearful planters and hopeful slaves alike. The story of Fairchild's fall grew, shifting from fact to legend. They say a slave rose up and cut down his master. They say he burned the fields so no whip could ever strike there again. They say his name was Samuel, and he was born of the master's own blood. Some spoke the story in fear, warning of rebellion. Others spoke it in hope, a prophecy that chains could be broken. Samuel's name became more than a man. It became a banner. On the road north, Samuel's people faced hunger, storms, and the constant threat of capture. But no obstacle was greater than the chains they had already broken. At night, by the fire, the children laughed, no longer silenced by fear. The elders told stories of Africa, memories carried across oceans. And Samuel, though wary, stood watch at the edge of camp, eyes on the horizon, a silent guardian of their fragile freedom. One evening, a young girl approached him, clutching his hand. "Are we safe now, Samuel?" He looked at her, then at the stars above. "Not yet, but safer than we were yesterday, and tomorrow. Safer still." Her smile was small, but it was enough. Back in Charleston, the ruins of the plantation became a warning. Planters spoke in hushed tones of the fire that consumed the Fairchild dynasty. Ministers thundered from pulpits about sin and rebellion. But no matter how they tried, they could not silence the whispers. For every lash in the South, Samuel's name burned hotter. For every chain fastened, his legend spread further. Years later, those who had walked with him told the story to their children the night the chains broke, the house burned, and the dynasty fell. Some details blurred, others grew larger than life. But always at the center was Samuel, the man who fought, who rose, who freed. And though time would carry him into the pages of history and myth alike, the truth remained: the Fairchild dynasty had died in fire, and from its ashes, the seed of freedom had been sown.